In the 1967 James Bond film, You Only Live Twice, the world's most famous secret agent finds himself engaged in a tense game of cat and mouse with his shadowy rivals in Japan. At one point, Bond is taken to see a ninja training camp run by the head of the Japanese Secret Service. As his helicopter makes its final descent to land, the viewer suddenly sees a magnificent white castle rising up from the landscape below. This is Himeji Castle. Towering over the surrounding landscape, it serves as a perfect cinematic backdrop for the improbable ninja training school that will help Bond defeat the forces of his archenemy. And in fact, the image of Bond's helicopter hovering over this majestic castle is more than apt, for in Japanese, Himeji Castle is often referred to by its more poetic nickname, the White Heron Castle, so named for its supposed resemblance to an elegant bird taking flight from the plains below. Though they may not have served as ninja training grounds, there were once a great many more castles like Himeji in Japan. Today, however, very few remain, and among those that do, Himeji is widely regarded as the best preserved and most beautiful. But it hails from a tumultuous time in Japanese history, a time when, for many, the idea of a unified Japan was merely a tantalizing mirage. And as it so happens, mirage is an apt term to describe the ingenious layout of Himeji, which was intended to confuse and frustrate any would-be attacker. In recognition of its seminal role in the history and architecture of a feudal Japan, in 1993, Himeji Castle was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Castles served much the same function in East Asia as they served in medieval Europe. Foremost, they were designed to serve as military strongholds and to protect and project political authority. But you won't find castles like Himeji just anywhere. These elaborate structures only arise in places where conflict is a constant threat, and political and military power is fragmented between warring fiefdoms. What's more, castles are expensive, and when they are no longer serving their original purpose, they quickly fall into disuse and dilapidation. For instance, ancient Chinese warlords once built many castles, but the last time China was parceled up into a kaleidoscope of competing fiefdoms was well over 1,000 years ago. After unifying the nation, the Chinese emperors were more concerned with building walls to defend against the perennial threat of nomadic invaders from the north, leaving the old castles to slowly erode away. But in Japan, the era of warring states did not end until about 400 years ago, in the early 17th century. For more than 500 years prior to that, prominent land-holding warlords, or daimyo, fought among each other for the right to be crowned the shogun, who presided over the fragile, decentralized administration that purported to rule the country on behalf of the impotent emperor in Kyoto. Yet the daimyo remained largely autonomous and were always on the lookout for an opportunity to take the mantle of shogun for themselves. To hold their territories against the constant threat of competitors, the daimyo built castles. But they bore little resemblance to Himeji. Built almost entirely out of wood, these simple fortifications were often built atop rocky terrain and cliffs, with dry moats surrounding the base. The warlord himself lived at the base of the hill, with the fort serving as a lookout and a place of retreat. Though easy to defend, these early wooden fortifications were vulnerable to siege, and those that weren't destroyed in sieges would eventually be taken apart for reuse in other construction projects. Not surprisingly then, none of these early castles have survived down to the present day. Now, the events that inspired the construction of castles like Himeji occurred during the second half of the 16th century. In 1543, the seafaring Portuguese introduced the arquebus, an early form of musket, into Japan. This quickly changed the strategic calculus of the battlefield. Along with new and improved cannon technology, which the Chinese and Japanese already possessed, the various combatants for the sole title of shogun no longer felt secure in their simple wooden castles. Not only that, but the field of contestants had now begun to shrink as smaller warlords were progressively swallowed up by larger ones. The prospect of open battle between ever larger and more dangerously armed alliances of warlords led to great changes in castle construction. In 1576, Oda Nobunaga, one of the leading daimyo and known for his innovative tactics in warfare, commissioned the first new-style castle on the outskirts of Kyoto. Now known as Azuchi Castle, it was the first to sit on a high stone foundation and be encircled by an outer stone wall. Rising up from the outer walls were watchtowers equipped with alarm bells. But most impressive of all was the Tenshu, or central keep. It rose 7 stories high, with the uppermost story gilded both inside and out. Unlike those remote mountain fortresses, Azuchi Castle was meant to be seen. In fact, it was deliberately built on top of a hill that overlooked the main road leading to the capital. No longer were Japanese castles a place of retreat in far-off corners of the country. Now they were capable of fending off even the most determined of foes. These new castles were nothing less than the architectural embodiment of an entirely new empire in the making. Unfortunately, that empire still had some bumps in the road. In 1582, Nobunaga was killed, and with his death, Azuchi Castle was destroyed as well. But in his wake, a series of even more ambitious daimyo rose to take his place as the unifier of Japan. The final, decisive battle took place near the town of Sekigahara in the year 1600. The victor was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who became Japan's new undisputed shogun and would finally bring a secure and stable rule that endured for the next 268 years. Of course, neither the new shogun nor the aspiring daimyo knew that yet. And during the 4 decades on either side of the Battle of Sekigahara, there was an explosion of castle building. In fact, scholars estimate that from 1575 to 1615, as many as 250 new-style castles were built across the Japanese islands. And this is where the origins of Himeji Castle lie. In 1601, the new shogun gave the land surrounding Himeji to his loyal son-in-law, a man named Ikeda Terumasa. Ikeda had won an important victory on the battlefield for his father-in-law, and Himeji was his reward. Now, Ikeda's new land grant sat on the strategically important Harima Plain. Anyone who wanted to travel from the western half of the main island of Honshu to the capital at Kyoto had to pass through this region. And since the new shogun still didn't trust the newly subjugated daimyo in western Honshu, the town of Himeji would need a much more formidable castle than the simple wooden fortifications that had sat atop it, its most prominent hill, for the past 3 centuries. So Ikeda tore it down and built a new one from scratch. For the next 8 years, until its completion in 1609, Himeji Castle would gradually take shape on Himeyama. The hill itself already rose up to 150 feet above the ground. The new Tenshu, or central keep, would double its total height to 300 feet. This would have been a novel sight for most Japanese. Prior to castles like Himeji, the only tall buildings in East Asia that could be seen from any distance were Buddhist pagodas, the greatest of which might rise to 200 feet or so. Now an even taller, secular symbol of political and military power would compete with sacred religious architecture for the awe and admiration of the masses. The construction of Himeji Castle involved far more than just the castle itself. The central keep sits within the innermost ring of several walled compounds, or baileys. Each compound is built into a series of increasingly elevated terraces. Together, they contain some 83 individual structures, culminating in the 6-story keep. Surrounding these 4 compounds is a large moat. From here, the town of Himeji, and 2 more moats, radiated outward from the castle complex. Because the outer walls of the compounds formed an irregular pentagon, the town also expanded in an irregular fashion. Previously, major Japanese cities, such as Kyoto, were laid out in accordance with imperial Chinese models, which followed a strictly planned grid organized around an immense rectangular palace complex at the center. But new castle towns like Himeji were unplanned, with curved, narrow streets following the irregular contours of the castle compounds. There was an upside to this urban chaos, though. It created an additional layer of defense that prevented invading armies from proceeding in a straight line of attack toward the castle. Now I think we're ready to take a tour of Himeji Castle. There are two main entrances, one in the east and one in the south. It is the southern gate that most visitors today will pass through. To reach the gate, you must first cross over a bridge that spans the inner moat. In 1601, this moat would have been the first feature of the new castle complex to have taken shape. Once the moat was dug out, a nearby river would be diverted to fill it with water. The excavated soil was then used to construct the ramparts on the leveled terraces. These ramparts would then be faced in stone to deter potential invaders and help deflect the arquebus fire. Unlike in European castles, these stones were not polished and cut into uniform blocks. In most of Himeji's walls, we find only undressed stones fitted together in clever fashion, with smaller rocks and pebbles inserted to fill the gaps. Now, when the supply of large stones ran out, the daimyo was not averse to making use of abandoned tombstones and stone lantern bases from Japanese temples. One popular story even claims that an old widow donated her millstone to the cause. Lodged in a wall near the central keep, it is now protected by wire mesh and memorialized with a plaque. With stones coming in so many different sizes and shapes, it seems incredible to learn that Himeji's walls were put together without the use of any mortar. As it turns out, this method was perfectly suited to the turbulent tectonics of the Japanese islands. During the many earthquakes they have experienced over the past 400 years, Himeji's mortarless walls, many of which rise to more than 60 feet, have been able to shift with the tremors and avoid significant structural damage. But it wasn't just earthquakes that they were impervious to. Look closely, and you'll notice that nearly all of Himeji's stone walls curve inward as they rise. Designed to prevent scaling intruders, these walls were said to be composed of mouse stones, since not even a mouse could climb them. The slope of the wall is also an engineering technique. By distributing weight over a broader base, the curve both decreases the strain on the lower parts of the foundation and serves to diffuse the water pressure from incessant rains. On the other side of the moat and the southern gate is the Sanomaru, or third compound. Today, it consists of a large open field with gardens and parks on its northern and western flanks. Now, except for the moat and walls, nearly everything in this part of the complex is unrecognizable from its original appearance in the Tokugawa era. At various times in history, both the third compound inside the moat and the land on the outside of the moat would have been home to facilities like a shooting range, a prison, and the homes of merchants, soldiers, and even some samurai. The number of soldiers stationed at Himeji differed for each daimyo. Under Ikeda, the first lord of the castle, only about 500 soldiers served the family. But under his successor, Honda Tadamasa, as many as 4,000 soldiers may have been stationed on the castle grounds. Honda himself actually moved his personal lodgings into this third compound. But regardless of the daimyo in charge, beyond this point, only the most privileged of his retainers, family members, and guests would have been allowed to reside in the inner compounds. In the late 19th century, after the overthrow of the Tokugawa Shogunate, most of these structures in the third compound were demolished and replaced with a military barracks, which was itself later removed. The southern gate, popularly known as the Cherry Blossom Gate, is also a modern construct built in the 1930s. So if we want to see Himeji Castle as it once was, we need to keep on walking north to the next set of stone walls. It is here that we encounter the Water Chestnut Gate, so named for water chestnuts carved into the top of each pillar. This is the largest of some 21 gates that still remain at Himeji. Originally, the entire complex had 84. It is said that this gate was removed from another castle in Kyoto and installed here to serve as the main entrance to the inner compounds. It's a splendid and imposing structure, and one that showcases the fine metalwork that was lavished on such gates. Two of the windows perched above are known as lantern windows. They are shaped like bells and decorated with black varnish and gilded accents, a design often found in Japanese temples. Important gates and walls like this one also often had iron plates attached to the surface or wedged inside to provide additional defense. Now, perhaps all these pleasing aesthetic features were built into the castle complex in hopes of distracting enemy invaders. But if you made it past the water chestnut gate, a stealthy ambush most likely awaited you on the other side. This is because the next courtyard was designed to trick the intruder. From the outside of the gate, you can't see a large square moat that covers most of the surface area of the next courtyard. As invading soldiers rushed through the gate in triumph, they would find themselves piled together in a very narrow space, with castle defenders pouring in from access points on the other three sides. Their likely fate was to be pushed into the moat, where they would be slaughtered. Now, in addition to drowning the daimyo's foes, this moat was also the primary source of water that was used to fight fires within the castle complex. Man-made fires were mercifully rare at Himeji, occurring only one time in the 19th century. But the occasional lightning strike was a perennial threat. In addition to this square moat and the other circular moats, Himeji Castle was also equipped with two more precautionary measures against fire. The first was what we would now categorize as within the realm of superstition: 6 gates whose names contain the Chinese character for water. The second method was far more effective. As it turns out, all those elegant white walls were not merely for looks. The plaster itself, which was applied to a mud wall underneath, is resistant to fire, an important consideration in anticipation of a hail of fire-tipped arrows shot into the premises. Some scholars think that the firefighting properties of this white plaster might be a result of political serendipity. That is, white was a color favored by those daimyo who were closer allies of the Tokugawa shogun, while black was a color favored by those whose loyalties were less certain. From the square moat, we can now turn left into the aptly named Nishinomaru, or Western Compound. Unlike the outer compound from whence we just came, this one is filled with evergreen trees that impede our view of the whole site. This was intentional. Evergreen trees and temporary bamboo screens were installed throughout the inner compounds to maintain secrecy from prying eyes. In the event of a siege, the trees could then be cut down and used for fuel. But few uninvited guests would ever be able to get anywhere near the inner compounds, for their tall stone walls were lined with strategically positioned watchtowers. Rising between 1 to 3 stories tall above the stone walls, these towers were usually built on the corners, since that was the easiest part of the wall to scale. In the western compound, you can see 2 such towers on the south side. Though these 2 towers have prosaic names, many watchtowers and other Japanese castles bear names that reflect a memorable activity that was once carried out there. Thus we have the Hostage Tower, Well Tower, Drum Tower, Gun Tower, Moon Viewing Tower, and Mount Fuji Viewing Tower. This compound has one too, the Vanity Tower, located on the opposite side in the northeastern corner. It was built for one of the shogun's daughters, Princess Sen, when she married into the Honda family. To the west, it is connected to the less poetically named Long Corridor, a series of fortified hallways, storage rooms, and covered galleries that winds its way for 1,000 feet from the southwestern watchtower toward the Vanity Tower. At various times over the centuries, the rooms in the Long Corridor were used as luxury living quarters, for storage space, or as defense posts. Having walked through the Long Corridor and exited out of the Vanity Tower, we are now ready to turn east towards the main keep, or Tenshu. From the northeastern corner of the western compound, we can enjoy a magnificent view of it. But though it looks like it is just around the corner, we have a long way to go before reaching it. This again was by design. From this point on, the path toward the Tenshu becomes a confusing labyrinth of high, narrow, zigzagging corridors that continues to frustrate tourists despite all the signs. Consider this. From the water chestnut gate to the Tenshu is just over 400 feet as the bird flies. But the hapless invader or tourist on foot is forced to go more than 3 times that distance. 2 gates come in quick succession, the Ha and the Ni gates, and after passing through each, you are forced to turn at a sharp right angle and then hike up a series of switchbacks. The narrow and claustrophobic path is intended to minimize the number of intruders who can charge up at the same time. Most of the gates by this point are quite small. Passage through the Ho gate, for instance, is so constricted that 2 samurai in full battle gear probably couldn't have passed through side by side at the same time. And if these defensive measures weren't enough, about every 10 feet or so, the tall white corridor walls on either side of you are punctuated with sama holes, or loopholes. There are about 1,000 such holes throughout the complex, shaped like circles, rectangles, or triangles. The rectangular holes were designed for defenders to shoot arrows at unsuspecting enemies on the other side, while the circular and triangular ones were for guns. All of them are telescoped inward on the defensive side. This allowed for maximum mobility on the part of the armed defenders on one side, with little ability to return fire from the other. This is the same concept as arrow slits and embrasures that you see atop European castles. Now, if you can survive all the tricks and traps designed to repel intruders so far, then your reward is the Showcase Tower of Himeji, a 6-story tenshu, rising up like an elegant white heron in flight. It's a mix of a Chinese pavilion and a Buddhist pagoda, and it was the only form of pre-modern Japanese architecture that could rival the pagoda for height. But the site is deceptive in more ways than one. First, there is not just one, but rather 4 interlocking towers that comprise the keep. Japanese tenshus did not conform to a uniform design, with some having just 1 tower and some having 2 or more towers connected by corridors. The tenshu at Himeji adopted the most elaborate design, with a single massive tower connected to 3 smaller towers through corridors accessed on the 2nd floor. This was considered the most secure type of tenshu, since it allowed for multiple defensive choke points and a lengthy path of retreat for the daimyo. As we climb up through the 6 stories of the tallest tower, each floor features artifacts and design features that were intended to protect the daimyo from attack. Since the only realistic chance of taking Himeji Castle was to subject it to a lengthy siege, the central tower is equipped with its own basement, kitchen, and well, along with generous stores of salt to keep food supplies edible. On the 1st floor, you'll find racks of firearms and gunpowder hanging from the bamboo hooks and nails. The 3rd and 4th floors contain secret stone-dropping chutes on the underside of its bay windows. Invisible from the outside when not in use, they made it possible for defenders in the central tower to drop large stones and boiling liquids on any invaders who had emerged from the labyrinth of corridors and was about to breach the tenshu. Once inside, any invader who tried to chase the daimyo up through the tallest tower was again in for a rude awakening. This is because the 5th floor is not visible from the outside. Instead, it is hidden within the ceiling of the 4th floor. Yet another design choice that was intended to confuse the enemy, who would not have expected a dark, windowless room where he thought the top story should be. In the unlikely event that all of Himeji's defensive measures failed, the daimyo would have retreated to the 6th story of the tenshu and there committed ritual suicide. But this never happened. In the more than 250 years that Himeji Castle stood during the Tokugawa era, not once did any rival daimyo feel brave enough to put its defenses to the test. In fact, would-be assailants grew so despondent about the prospect of ever breaching Himeji's walls that they turned to espionage instead. From the top floor of the tenshu, you can look down out one of the southern windows for a view of the innermost compound below. There lies Okiku's well. As one version of the story goes, Okiku was a loyal maidservant of one of the daimyo's allied retainers. When she heard of an assassination plot against the daimyo, she told her samurai boyfriend all about it, and thus helped to foil the scheme. In retaliation, one of the plotter's associates later accused her of having stolen a plate from a valuable set of china. The accusation stuck, and she was executed and thrown in this well. It is said that for many years, her ghostly voice could be heard rising up from the well, forever counting the number of dishes in the china set. 1 piece, 2 piece, 3 pieces. After 268 years of peace, the Tokugawa Shogunate was overthrown in a military coup known as the Meiji Restoration. The country's new leaders were eager to prove their ability to modernize Japan along Western lines, and castles like Himeji suddenly became an unwelcome reminder of its all-too-recent feudal past. Over the next several decades, the vast majority of Japanese castles were dismantled, destroyed, or neglected into ruin. Scholars estimate that there were around 170 castles like Himeji across Japan during the Tokugawa era. Today, there are only 25, and of those, only 12 retain their original tenshu. Himeji Castle itself was sold at auction in 1871 for the equivalent of $1,900, with plans to raze it to the ground for what was considered to be its more valuable real estate. That never happened, but it took some time for Himeji to be embraced by the new Japanese state as a symbol of national pride. That finally gained steam in the 1930s, as Japan formed its own empire abroad and began to adopt past symbols of military power to serve as an inspiration to the public. The fact that Himeji Castle survived an American bombing raid of the city during World War II only added to its growing aura. If you want to place Himeji Castle within a larger historical context, then consider the following question. Why does the standard tourist itinerary in Japan always include a famous castle like Himeji, while a visitor to China will invariably make a pilgrimage to one of its great walls? At the beginning of this lecture, we noted that China doesn't really have castles. For castles were the product of a politically divided state, one in which hundreds of only recently pacified warlords might choose to invade your fiefdom at any moment. But it was precisely the fragmented nature of the Tokugawa Shogunate that provided a disincentive for Western gunboats to push too hard on Japanese leaders in the second half of the 19th century. It was far easier and more lucrative to turn those cannons on Chinese armies. After all, a treaty signed by the emperor in Beijing would be fully honored by all his civil and military officials throughout the realm. But there was no such guarantee in Japan, where the daimyo in Himeji Castle might very well refuse to recognize an agreement signed by the shogun, to say nothing of one brokered by a rival daimyo. In that sense, castles like Himeji represent much more than just a pretty feudal face. Ironically, they also serve as a reminder of why a handful of mountainous islands filled with semi-autonomous warlords managed to catch up within just a few decades to the far more centralized and resourceful Chinese empire. For Himeji Castle didn't just deter other Japanese daimyo from an attack. For an entirely different reason, it also deterred Western empires from imposing upon Japan the same sort of crushing, unequal treaties that would soon usher in a century of political anarchy in China. So in that sense, Himeji Castle truly is a monument worthy of the respect and adulation of anyone who admires Japan's stunning achievements over the last century and a half.